When you understand what's underneath that Second Amendment, when you engage with what it's really doing and why it's there and the work that it continues to do.
Welcome to another episode of Black and Excellent. Today we have with us author, historian, educator, and Tumblr regular, Carol Anderson. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Chi. Thank you.
So by the end of this interview, what would you like our viewers to have learned or be more curious about?
Actually, I would like for them to really engage with American history, not the myth of American history, but the reality of American history, and be able and willing to go back into what the folks were actually saying, not what we were told they said, but what they actually said and why they said it. That's what I want. I think about the pushback that we're having now in our school boards, in our state legislatures, about teaching what they call divisive topics, and that we need to have a patriotic history. What on earth does that really mean? And so to be able to push back from evidence about what that really entails in terms of erasing slavery, erasing genocidal violence against indigenous people, erasing the paradox of America, where you could have, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and we've got chattel slavery. So, and understanding why we have chattel slavery. So being able to wrestle with that paradox. I want our folks to be able, after the end of this interview, after hearing it, after engaging with it, to go, ooh, I wonder what else I didn't know.
Can you talk about why we as a country feel so, very loosely, as a country, feel so attached to an outdated constitution or doctrine that obviously has racist foundations?
And I think part of it really deals with the narratives that we have been fed about these absolutely noble founding fathers who had the will and the strength and the vision to take on the most powerful government on earth, the British Empire, and to fight the British for their freedom. We love that David and Goliath story here. We love the underdog winning, and winning for all that is good, right, and just. I mean, so that narrative is tapping into the notion of our better selves. And so, but part of what happens then is that when you begin to complicate that narrative with the reality that you have folks who are slave holders, you have folks who are breeding human beings, you have folks who are buying and selling babies, then that is, and so we know that that's not noble. Nobody wants to say, hey, I'm all for slavery. Even the lie of the lost cause says, oh no, this wasn't about slavery, because at a certain level, we know that slavery is wrong. And so we buy into it because we like to think of ourselves in our best light. The problem with that narrative is that it's not accurate. And so it's a myth. And so when we're building our house on a basis of myths, that house is continually wobbling all over the place. I look at it like therapy. You know, when you don't go in and tell the truth about how you got here and what you have endured, you keep doing the same mess over and over and over. You never get well. As long as we tell this story without engaging the role of slavery in the foundation of this nation, the role of slavery in the creation of the Constitution, the role of slavery in the way that we conceptualize the militia, then all of the stuff we are dealing with today doesn't make sense.
So you mentioned that the US needs therapy. What would the US's first therapy session look like or focus on?
It would focus on Yes. It would focus on
Take your time, because that's a lot.
it's a lot. I mean, it's like, where do I begin? So it would actually focus in on the initial settlers who came here from Europe. So what we would deal with would be what I call the Rick Santorum School of History. So remember Rick Santorum, who was a former CNN analyst and congressman? He said, well, you know, America was just empty until the Europeans came here. And then we built it. We built this strong nation. And so that notion of Europeans built America all by themselves, and that there was nothing here, it was an empty wilderness. We need to go back and begin to tell the truth there. That's where we start, with that founding, with the indigenous people who are here, with the role that they played in helping those Europeans survive, in the role that they played in terms of providing the kinds of material goods that these Europeans needed in order to be able to make it through. So just understanding that foundational piece. This wasn't empty wilderness that the Europeans sashayed up into and just said, oh, I think we're gonna build something. No, that didn't roll out that way. And right. So we've got to tell the truth. And then we have to deal with the truth of slavery. We have had so much bad history on slavery, so dominated coming out of the Civil War and then into the 20th century, well into the 20th century, that slavery was a benevolent institution, that that the enslaved were well fed, they were well cared for, they were treated like family. And you know what? And they loved it. They liked it. Black folks loved being enslaved. Now, logically, that makes no doggone sense. And it took scholars, like starting in the 1960s, to say, well, if they loved it so much, why do they keep running away? So those are the kinds of questions we have to ask when we begin to delve into what slavery actually was, how it operated, and how then you had these folks who were fighting for their freedom against the tyranny of Britain, being able to juxtapose their enslavement of human beings with their own quest for freedom. It helps us really begin to engage the paradox of America. That's where I would start.
So basically, we need to start at the beginning and start asking the hard questions and being willing to have those difficult conversations, because it makes it makes most people uncomfortable to have these types of questions, these types of conversations.
Well, because part of it is when you think about so much of identity of who you are is invested in these kinds of noble narratives, right? So my grandfather came over here from Europe. He had nothing, and he worked hard, and he pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and bootstraps. Woo! And look at us now, right? And so that kind of narrative is so important to the ways that people define themselves and their space and their place in this society. And so when you begin to question that, so you're not questioning that the grandfather came over, but what you're questioning is the bootstraps narrative. It doesn't mean that he didn't work hard. It doesn't mean that he didn't have ingenuity. What it means is that there was government policy around your grandfather that provided home loans, that provided access to good union jobs, that provided a pathway to promotion within those good union jobs, that provided a GI Bill so that your grandfather could then go to college and have it paid for, and then be able to get that great engineering job. So all of this government policy that was around your grandfather gets wiped away in this narrative of bootstraps. And so then when Black folks are talking about the inequities in American society, then it's like, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We did. And so it seems like it's an assault and attack on their narrative, and that you then get this framing of makers and takers. That, so it's, as again, I go back to the Rick Santorum School of History. So you've got the makers, the folks who came here to this empty wilderness land and built it up all by themselves. And then you have the takers, who are these Black folk who always want, as Andrew Johnson said, basically a government handout. When you interrogate that narrative, you're coming up with a very different script about the development and the creation of the United States of America. And so much of my work as a historian is to really correct the narratives, to provide strong evidence-based analyses that scholars and students and teachers and just regular folk can begin to look at and go, "Ooh, is that what that was? Is that how that went down?" Mm-hmm. So that's what I set out to do in my books.
Speaking about your book, so one of your chapters really hit home for me. So like really had me sitting there and rethinking a few things. So, and that was chapter 4. I myself am not a gun fanatic at all. And I recently considered moving to Texas, but I realized that, I can't show up to a gunfight with a dazzling personality. It's just not enough. It just really is not enough. So like, in thinking about chapter 4, I really kind of want to restate the title and the question that you asked at the top of chapter 4, in naming it, "How can I be unarmed when my Blackness is the weapon that you fear?"
Yes, I mean, and that chapter really is the culmination of what I have been arguing throughout this, that it is anti-Blackness that creates the precarity of Black life in America. It is anti-Blackness that is driving the gun debates. And so whether armed or unarmed, Black people are the default threat in American society. With Black as the default threat, when you add guns to it, it heightens that threat level exponentially. And so I start off that chapter, of course, with the Black Panthers, who decided, given the police brutality raining down on the Black community, and that there was absolutely no accountability response in the system, that they themselves would begin to police the police. And they knew the gun laws. I mean, so they knew what kinds of weapons they could carry. They knew how they could carry them. They knew where they could carry them, when they could carry them. And so they would sit there, and when the cops would arrest somebody, the Panthers would roll up and watch the police, and the Panthers were armed. The cops hated it. 8 Ways to Sunday hated it. And they ran to Don Mulford, who was the California assemblyman, saying, "You've got to do something. These Panthers are a threat. These Black Panthers, they are serious. You've got to make what they're doing illegal, because every time we pull them over, we can't arrest them because they know the law. So we got to change the law." And Mulford's like, "I got this." And Mulford, this conservative assemblyman, works with a representative of the NRA to draft this legislation to turn open carry, to make open carry illegal, basically to make what the Panthers are doing to police the police illegal. Governor Ronald Reagan is like, "I will eagerly sign on to this bill the moment it hits my desk." Now, you see, what they weren't doing was figuring out how to bring accountability to the police. Instead, what they were doing was trying to figure out how to make illegal what the Panthers were doing to protect the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Speaking of policing, given the racist foundations of policing, starting, as you mentioned earlier, with militia in America, can you envision a world in which institutions like law enforcement protects all citizens?
Feel like John Lennon imagined. What I liken this to is that we know we do need to have some protection because there are predators out there. Mm-hmm. We know this. What has happened has been the vilification and the criminalization of Blackness that makes Black people the automatic criminals, the automatic threat. That's the work that this society must do to dismantle anti-Blackness in every nook and cranny of American society. So right now what we have is this thing where Black people are like, the cops are killing us, stop killing us. And then it's like, well, you don't want the cops there, so you're on your own. And it's like making this, I use this analogy. There was a physician named Michael Swango who killed his patients. Mm-hmm. And he would kill a slew of patients. The hospital would find out about it and like, oh, we don't want this to get out. And so they would just quietly fire him. And so he'd move to the next hospital and do it. And then they'd figure it out. And then he'd move to the next hospital and do it, right? And so what it's saying is that if we say we want healthcare, then it's the society saying you can have Michael Swango or you can have nothing. Those shouldn't be our polar options. Having a doctor who will just kill you because he wants to kill you, or having nothing at all so that you can't maintain your wellness. Those aren't viable options, but that's what we're confronted with when it comes to policing in this society. When Black folks say, we want quality policing, we need to be able to know that predators are out there and that they will be removed from our community so that they don't do damage to us. Mm-hmm. Instead, we get, you can have Michael Swango or you can have nothing. No.
Unacceptable. In thinking of that, is there a world in which defund the police and the Second Amendment as it stands happily coexist?
Well, as I laid out in the book, with the Second Amendment, understanding that the Second Amendment was rooted in anti-Blackness and the fear of Black people, and understanding that it was about make the slaveholders in Virginia wanting to make sure that they could control the militia because they couldn't trust the feds to do it. Because they're like, those folks from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, they're not sending the militia in when the enslaved are coming after us. We're going to be left defenseless. So we need to control the militia. And this was the bribe that James Madison provided in the Constitution to the slaveholders so that they wouldn't have another constitutional convention and just dismantle this strong central government that he wanted. And so seeing how the Second Amendment was really based on anti-Blackness and the control of Black people, we need to treat the Second Amendment the same way we treat the Three-Fifths Clause. That right now, it's holding this venerable spot, almost right up there with the First Amendment, where folks like, I got free speech. And they're like, I got the right to have my gun. When you understand what's underneath that Second Amendment, when you engage with what it's really doing and why it's there and the work that it continues to do, as I said, it is like, I quoted the Justice Jackson when he said, racism is a loaded weapon, just waiting to be used under some kind of guideline, under some kind of pernicious excuse. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're seeing here with the Second Amendment. So I don't see that the Second Amendment can coexist with a safe society where we are really truly secure, because it is designed to make us insecure. So much so, because of the anti-Blackness that undergirds it, that we are willing to let these mass shootings go without any kind of adequate response because we're so afraid of being just like the slaveholders down in Virginia in the 1700s, being left defenseless. So for instance, Jonathan Metzl wrote this book, Dying of Whiteness. And so one of the things that he did was he went to a self-help group that was dealing with, these were folks, white folks in Missouri, mm-hmm. who had suffered gun violence in their family. And so in that discussion, in that self-help group was, what about gun safety laws? And they were like, absolutely not, because all of those people will be coming in from St. Louis trying to take everything that we have. Our guns are the only thing that protect us from those folks in St. Louis. Now, you know, those folks in St. Louis is code for Black folk. Mm-hmm. Right? So that being left defenseless from all of these Black folks trying to take what we have. So we're willing to cut that deal, make that bargain. So we're willing to be unsafe in our grocery stores, unsafe in our churches, unsafe where we work, unsafe where we play, where we go to the movie theater, knowing that anybody can walk in there and just blow us away and that there will be no response because of this fear of Black people and being left defenseless.
That's really hard to sit with because it's
yeah, it is. Think about Sandy Hook, right?
Yeah. These
children were gunned down. And the response was, oh, well.
The response was, let's arm our teachers or let's teach our students how to act during active mass shootings. Or now we have a whole market of door jam locks and things of that nature instead of actually going to the root of the problem.
Exactly.
Which is the freedom of guns.
Right. Exactly. We're willing. So it is that, again, that language of being left defenseless. Lauren Boebert, the congresswoman out of Colorado, she posted out on one of her social media things about, they take our guns, if they defund the police, we will be left defenseless against these gangbangers, against these thugs, against these drug dealers. Now, we all know that in American society, though that's coded language, those are those dog whistles that mean Black people, thugs, gangbangers, drug dealers. And so what she's saying is that we don't have our guns, whites will be left defenseless against all of those Black people. Mm-hmm. That again is the language that we heard in Virginia in the 1700s. Mm-hmm.
What are your first thoughts when you hear a statement like, I don't see color? And what exactly. And what advice would you give to someone who says that? I already have the advice that I give, but what are your first thoughts when someone says that? And what advice would you give the speaker?
One of the key devices to undermine and undercut the response to the civil rights movement was the language of colorblindness. I don't see color. So what that's saying is that I am erasing hundreds of years of racism and discrimination and discriminatory policies that have created the space where we are right now, that have so limited the options and the choices of you and your ancestors. I'm erasing that history and saying, kumbaya, aren't we all the same? Aren't we all at the same spot? And the answer is no. So it is a denial of my humanity, and it is denial of my ancestors' humanity. It is denial of their struggle. It is a denial of the work that they did to get us to this point. It is a la-la land where where that it denies where we even are today. So we have the studies that show that when you have equal resumes, but you change the name at the top, one is Gregory, one is Jamal. Mm-hmm. So a racially identifiable name, Jamal has to send in more resumes in order to get the interview than Gregory does. And they're the same.
Yep.
It's what we saw in the subprime mortgage crisis, where Black folks, 2/3 of Black folks were pushed into these risky subprime mortgages, although they had the credit worthiness to be in the regular mortgage products. Mm-hmm. And it is the studies that consistently show that regardless of insurance levels, that Black folks have worse treatment in our healthcare system. There's an inability to recognize that Black folks feel pain. There's the consistent unwillingness to do a real deep diagnosis. I mean, the studies are out there that keep showing where we are right now. So to say that we are colorblind, it is like trying to drive on a major freeway, like here in Atlanta on I-85, with your blindfolds on and thinking you're not going to crash. You saw COVID-19, where the life expectancy of African Americans dropped by 3 years. It dropped more than any doggone buddy else. Mm-hmm. That is the power of structural racism.
Yeah. But
I don't see color. No, not at all. We are all the same.
Until we're not.
Until we're not, right?
Until we're not. So you mentioned the book, The Second Amendment is, I'm going to read your quotes specifically, is inherently structurally flawed. So based on Black exclusion and debasement, that unlike the other amendments, it can never be a pathway to civil and human rights for 47.5 million African Americans. With that knowledge, where do we go? What's the next step?
And the next step is to really begin to tell the truth about the Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. It is really to begin to understand that it is so fundamentally, structurally flawed, that there's no tweaking about, is this about a well-regulated militia, or is this about the individual rights to bear arms? No, it is about anti-Blackness. And so when you understand that it is about anti-Blackness, those debates that are happening in the Supreme Court are getting ready to happen on a New York case, on a gun control case, those aren't the real arguments. That's the superstructure. That's not the real tectonic plates that is driving this thing. So beginning to have the conversations about what the Second Amendment really is will allow us to pull off the mask and to see it in all of its ugliness and to treat it accordingly.
Can you give our viewers a little homework assignment? In addition to, of course, reading the Second Amendment, can you give our viewers something to kind of piggyback on the Second Amendment and our conversation here today?
Look at the laws. For instance, go through the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report on Stand Your Ground. So we understand Stand Your Ground as being one of the kind of hallmark laws dealing with the right to self-defense. See the way that Stand Your Ground actually plays out in American society. See the disparate impact that has on Black folks. See how it really just opens up almost a license to kill for whites who kill Black people. And then ask yourself why, in this kind of landmark legislation dealing with the basic right to self-defense, Black folks clearly don't have the right to stand your ground. Mm-hmm. And why is that? Yeah. That's
an amazing assignment. So anyone chooses to do that, please feel free to comment below, add what you've learned below, and Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you so much. I learned, as you saw, I took a few notes myself. I learned a lot during this conversation. I know our viewers are super excited to read the book. Can you let us know where we can find the second?
Yes, and so you can find it at bookstores anywhere, your independent bookstores, as well as kind of the big online sellers, and on the Bloomsbury.com website, because Bloomsbury is my publisher, and you can also get it there.
Yes. Awesome. We'll add some links below. Again, we cannot thank you enough for coming back and teaching and educating us in the way that you can, Carol. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Chi. Thank you.